All right, we should be recording and live, so hope you guys are having a great day. So, really great questions in this week's Q&A. So, let's go ahead and just dive in. So, question number one is from Karen. So, should there be a protein max for each meal? As a woman in medically induced menopause, should there be a limit to how much protein I'm consuming in one setting? So, really great question. So, for a really long time, there was this kind of idea that the body could only utilize or absorb a certain amount of protein, not only per day, but also per meal. And that myth over time, as research has evolved, has basically been put to bed. So there isn't really a limit of how much protein can be utilized and absorbed in any given meal, honestly. Like the limit, I wouldn't say it doesn't exist necessarily, but it would have to be something really extreme for the body to not over time, like over the next few hours when you're digesting that food, to not actually digest and absorb that protein and utilize it for anything. Um, Now, here's some caveats. There's also this idea that, okay, you can utilize and absorb all of the protein, but maybe not all of it is actually going to be used for building muscle, right? That's another kind of caveat with all of this. Whereas when we actually look at the research, especially newer research, there was a study that came out probably about maybe a year ago, probably somewhere between 6 months and a year ago. And they actually tested 100 grams of protein in one sitting and saw that up to 100 grams of protein in one sitting, the person was able to actually utilize all of that for muscle protein synthesis, or there wasn't at least a cap. There wasn't like, oh, only 40 grams of that is used for muscle protein synthesis, which is what kind of was hypothesized before, where it seems like even up to 100 grams in one sitting can be utilized for building, repairing muscle tissue over time, because that 100 grams is going to be digested over a longer time span, over multiple hours, maybe 6 hours or so, especially depending on what other kind of foods you maybe had with that meal, versus if you had a smaller portion of protein. So when we actually look at things, there doesn't seem to be necessarily a physiological limit of what's okay, the max you should have per meal for just generally absorbing protein and utilizing it for muscle protein synthesis, so building muscle, or using it for other things too. Like protein's used for other things in the body, repairing skin, hair, nails, all of those things. So protein can be utilized for that as well. And even just the calories from protein can be utilized too, and will be digested, absorbed, and utilized for daily tasks and energy and everything if needed. So doesn't really seem to be a physiological limit necessarily or a max. And like you being in medically induced menopause doesn't really change that. If anything, it makes it maybe a bigger emphasis that you want to put on making sure you really hit that protein goal as well. So there are some practical limits though to think about where if you, let's say your goal is 120 grams of protein and you didn't eat any protein nearly for breakfast and lunch, maybe some like trace amounts of protein that you're just probably going to get by accident. But let's say you've had like 20 grams of protein between breakfast and lunch, and now you have 100 grams to hit for dinner. Now, physiologically, like your body's probably still going to utilize all of that protein, but practically, it's probably not the best route to go because now you're trying to cram in 100 grams of protein just for dinner, which is going to be really hard to do to hit that amount of protein. There have been meals that I have had in my life that are 100 grams of protein worth, but they are pretty few. Usually, if I start having more than like 70 grams of protein per meal, like that's getting up there. Like usually my protein somewhere falls around probably like 60-ish grams per meal. And keep in mind, I aim for roughly 200 grams of protein per day. Between 180 and 200 is kind of my goal. So, for somebody who's maybe aiming for 120 grams of protein, having 40 to 50 grams of protein per meal, maybe even 30 to 40 is probably plenty. So it's not really a physiological max. Practically, once you get above like 50 grams of protein per meal, it's going to be really tough. So probably spacing it out is a better route to go. So you're not having these like crazy huge high protein meals, because then spacing it out allows protein to just easily be able to hit throughout the day, because protein is very filling. So if you try to cram in a lot in one sitting, it's going to be difficult. But also, like you want to feel full through all parts of the day, not just really full after one meal. And like I said, protein is very filling. So if we can space that protein out a little bit more evenly, maybe between 3 meals out of the day. So if your goal is 120, let's say we have 3 meals that are 40 grams each, that's going to be probably more beneficial um, uh, for just feeling full after breakfast until lunch, feeling full after lunch until dinner, and so on. There's also some physiological reasons as to why maybe we would want to have like at least 30 to 40 grams of protein um, every 4 hours or so, based on how muscle protein synthesis or muscle building works. Where usually when you have a big bolus of protein, let's say 40 grams worth, you see this big spike in muscle repair, and then it starts to kind of dwindle down over time, and then after about 3 or 4 hours, you're able to get another spike if you have a 40-gram protein meal, and then you see that kind of dwindle down again. Whereas if you are having just one big meal of like 120 grams of protein, all of your protein in one meal, you don't necessarily get 3 spikes throughout the day. And with research, it doesn't seem to matter as far as outcomes. So it's nothing to like hyper stress about of, oh, I need to eat every 4 hours and I need to get protein every 4 hours or I'm going to ruin results or not get results. Like it's not that extreme, but there is some like mechanistic reasons as to why probably having 3 meals with that are evenly distributed with protein is probably a good idea. You don't need to eat every 2 hours or every 3 hours necessarily, like some people had recently thought. But overall, there's not really a max with protein. So you do what you got to do to hit that total protein goal. Like that's what matters the most, how many total grams of protein you're eating per day. But probably a practical um, good thing to do is, or practically good thing to do is split that up between about 3 meals. And there's maybe some very minor physiological benefit of maybe splitting it up too. So I would go that route. But if you got to get in, 70 grams of protein in one meal just to hit your protein goal, if that's the case, then that total protein is the most important. So hopefully that answered your question there, Karen. So Anna looks like she has a couple of questions. So number one is, when you lose weight, does your total energy expenditure change? So yes. So it changes for a couple of reasons. One reason it changes is just because your overall body mass is smaller. Somebody who is 200 pounds is going to, at rest, just sitting around, not moving, is going to burn more calories than somebody who's 150 pounds likely, because their body is just bigger. So like to maintain their tissues for replacement of skin, hair, nails, even for their heart to beat, for their lungs to work. All of these things require energy or calories to do. So a bigger body is going to require more calories 9 times out of 10, if not 10 out of 10 times. So when you lose 30 pounds, your body is smaller, it has less tissue on it, it has less of those processes it needs to repair and so on. So it's going to burn a little bit less. It's usually not that significant from just that, unless you've lost like a crazy amount of weight. Like you can kind of get a rough estimate of this from like some calculators, and calculators aren't perfect, like your energy expenditure calculator you find online, but it might give you a rough idea of, okay, let me put my stats in and then see what my energy expenditure is when I'm 10 pounds less. And I believe if you put that in and kind of compare numbers, the rough numbers will tell you, I believe for every 10-ish pounds you lose, your energy expenditure might go down anywhere from like 50 to 100 calories. So for every 10 pounds, you might need about 100 calories less. So if you lose, let's say 50 pounds, you might need 500 calories less than what you needed before. But also keep in mind too, if somebody starts at 200 pounds and let's say they lose 50 pounds and get to 150, but when they were 200 pounds, they weren't active, they weren't exercising, they were sitting around, they weren't going on walks, they weren't getting 8,000 steps or 10,000 steps. So they're really sedentary. And then they made this lifestyle change to start working out more along with tracking their nutrition, and they lost 40 to 50 pounds. Well, because now they're more active as they've lost that weight, their energy expenditure might actually be higher. They might actually burn more calories than what they did when they were 200 pounds, even though they're lighter, but it's because their lifestyle has changed. So when we think about does your calorie burn or energy expenditure change as you lose weight, we're thinking about all variables being constant. So somebody who's walking 10,000 steps, lifting 3 days a week, eating this certain amount of food, has this specific lifestyle, and you keep all those variables the same, but you just reduce their weight by 40 pounds, they're going to burn a little bit less calories. Uh, and another reason why your calorie burn might change when you lose weight is there is this thing called metabolic adaptation, which I've talked about, before, which is when you eat less calories, which is usually required to lose weight to a certain extent. When you eat less calories, your body is getting less energy. So things like fidgeting or talking with my hands that I'm doing here, even blinking, subconscious things slow down in some people and slow down a lot in some people versus others. So when that happens, when you're eating less calories as you're losing weight, you might burn a little bit less calories than what you would expect or what a calculator might predict. So you might think you should be burning 2,000 calories, but you might actually be burning 1,800 because of those things subconsciously slowing down because you're eating less food. And then also, the body does kind of sense sometimes that you've lost body fat. It senses, okay, here's my body fat, quote unquote, set point. Here's how much body fat my frame has. And this is kind of like their body fat thermostat. And as you lose body fat, especially as you get really lean and your body senses, oh, I'm getting to a pretty low body fat percentage, it might also slow down some of those subconscious things, maybe even some physiological things like your thyroid hormone and other hormone production, maybe even body heat regulation. It might slow some of that stuff down a little bit to burn even less calories too. So there's also a couple of other like metabolic adaptation related things when you lose weight that your energy expenditure will slow down because of those reasons. But probably the biggest one is just your overall body size being smaller. And it kind of had a second question here then. So let's say if your recommended daily calorie intake for weight loss is 1,900 calories and you're consuming 1,500 calories regularly instead. The pro of that is obviously faster weight loss, right? You're eating 1,500 versus 1,900 to lose weight. But are there any cons of not getting enough calories besides potential burnout? Like, will it affect fat versus muscle or anything? Great question. So yes, when you are in a calorie deficit, so you're eating less calories than what you burn to lose body fat, obviously burnout is probably the most obvious one, right? If you're eating 1,500 calories, but your body burns 2,400 calories per day, that's a 900 calorie deficit, and that's pretty steep. And you're gonna feel it, you're gonna be really hungry, your cravings are gonna rise, your energy levels are gonna decrease, and you're gonna get burnt out faster. Versus if you ate 1,900 calories and you were in just a 500 calorie deficit. So burnout is obviously one. Another thing is you might lose more fat eating the 1,500 versus the 1,900 because you're in a bigger deficit. But it might not be like as much more body fat as what you would think and what you predict because of those things I kind of mentioned in that previous question where when you eat less calories, things like fidgeting, talking with your hands, blinking slow down, and those things slow down even more the more extreme your deficit is. So what I'm saying is you might predict, okay, if you eat 1,900 calories versus your maintenance at 2,400, that's a 500 calorie deficit, right? You eat 1,900 calories and let's say you lose 1 pound of fat per week. Well, you might be thinking, well, that's a 500 calorie deficit per day. I'm losing 1 pound of fat. So let me bring my calories down by another 500 and go down to 1,400. And then I'll lose double the weight. I'll lose 2 pounds of fat. That might be what you're thinking in your head. But that predicted fat loss tends to usually get smaller than what we would expect based on equations because of those things slowing down with your metabolism, maybe even some of those hormonal things, thyroid and all of that, where if you double your deficit, so you increase your deficit to now a 1,000 calorie deficit where you think you would lose 2 pounds of fat, you might actually only lose 1.5 pounds of fat, or maybe even 1.25. And the extra returns, quote unquote, of investment you get as far as more fat loss for the steeper deficit might actually be smaller than what you would predict and expect because you get diminishing returns for every extra 100 calorie deficit you try to add to your fat loss phase. You will lose a little bit less fat than expected because of those mechanisms coming into play of slowing down. And that's not even to mention your cravings rising and you being more likely to either binge from a burnout and then gain a bunch of weight back, Or it also, like, the more the higher your cravings are, the more likely you're going to actually, quote unquote, like, I hate using this term, I never use this term, but cheat on your diet or cheat on your calories, meaning you are tracking 1400 or 1500, but you're reaching into the bag of chips and grabbing a few handfuls here and there throughout the day that maybe you're not really logging because your hunger is just overall so much higher. So your logging becomes a little bit less accurate there too. So those are a couple of cons. The burnout, the extra fat loss you get from a steeper deficit, it's not proportional to the extra deficit you try to create because of those things slowing down. And then number three is when you bring your calories down lower, your workout performance is probably going to dip. So you're going to not be performing as well on your workouts, which means you're not stimulating your muscle as much, which means you're more likely to actually lose muscle the greater the deficit. And also, calories in general are very protein or muscle sparing. So the more calories you eat, the less likely you are going to lose muscle. So the less calories you eat, the more likely you are to lose muscle. So you might, be in a 1900 calorie deficit, losing 1 pound on average per week, and you might lose 10 pounds of fat in 10 weeks. And you might then think, okay, well, I'm going to double my deficit, so I'm going to go down to 1400, and I'm going to lose 2 pounds per week. And maybe you actually lose 2 pounds per week, but maybe only 12 of it is fat mass, and maybe 8 of it is muscle and water. So you actually are losing more muscle and water versus just strictly fat. So the bigger your deficit is, the more likely you are to lose muscle as well. So that's why, like, creating the right calorie deficit for a fat loss phase is really a balancing act where we want to be in enough enough of a calorie deficit throughout the week on average to lose like an amount of body fat that like feels noticeable. So we get that positive reinforcement that, okay, we're making progress, but we don't want it to be too steep to where we are going to burn out, or we're going to binge, or we're going to just kind of snack on things and not log it. And we don't want it to be too extreme to where we tip the scales in the other direction of, okay, now we are losing muscle instead of fat, which does happen the steeper the deficit. So more, quote unquote, is not always better when it comes to the more of the deficit you're in and you think, oh, I can just suffer through and like I'm not really that hungry, so I'll just lose more body fat. It's not always the case because a lot of times, you'll end up losing some muscle if it is, pretty extreme. So hopefully that answered your question, Anna. Vicky had another question. So when you're recording the amount of weights you use when doing the workouts, do you record the weight of the dumbbell or do you double it since you're using two weights? So what she's referring to, I'm assuming, is let's say you are doing like a Romanian deadlift. So you have a dumbbell in each hand, dumbbell Romanian deadlifts, and let's say each one is 30 pounds. Do you log it as 30 pounds or 60 pounds? I typically log all dumbbell exercises with the amount of weight that I am using in each hand. So I would log that as 30 pounds. In reality, it doesn't really matter how you log it. Unless you are doing a competition where you need to dumbbell Romanian deadlift a certain weight and like the rules are, or the way they measure the amount of weight you're lifting is by either, each dumbbell in each hand or adding it together, or like, with the squat, some people will ask, okay, like, do I log the weight that I put on the bar or do I log the weight on the bar? And it really doesn't matter. The most important thing is that you know what it means. So when you do that same workout next week and you're seeing, okay, last week I have written down that I did 60 pounds for 10 reps. I either know that means I'm doing 60 pounds in each hand. So like next week I can maybe try 65 pounds in each hand and go up a little bit. Or I know that means, okay, I had 30 pounds in each hand. So next week I'm going to try 35 pounds in each hand. So in reality, it really does not matter how you log it as long as you know what it means. You could have some weird Morse code type of logging where like you don't even put the exact numbers because you're afraid of somebody looking in your logbook and knowing exactly how much weight you lift. And you could put some funky things in there. But as long as you know what it means, so you can do the same weight next week and do a couple of extra reps, or you can go up a little bit in weight for next week and try to progress. That's what's important. So I think people get really hung up on how to log those weights. And I personally, when I do dumbbell exercises, I log it as whatever the dumbbell is in each hand. But if you were to add them together and do it that way, like that's perfectly fine as long as you know what it means and know how to progress from it. Um, she also asked another question on your maintenance days during fat loss. Do you still do the fat loss daily steps or do you back the steps down? So this is a great question. So usually when I have clients do fat loss phases, you know, we will maybe bump steps up to, let's say, 10,000 or sometimes even more. Sometimes depending on the client, we hit like 12,000, but a lot of times it's 10,000, and in maintenance phases, we'll stay at 8,000 steps. So she's basically asking, okay, when we have maintenance days throughout the week, because the way we set up fat loss phases and how I recommend setting it up is having 5 or 6 days usually that are kind of your fat loss range of calories, and then 1 or 2 days that are maintenance. So basically, do we go up to maintenance not only with our calories 1 or 2 days a week, but do we also bring steps down to like a maintenance level of 8,000? It's kind of up to you. I think keeping it at 10,000 is usually what I end up recommending to do, just because like now you're only having one variable that's changing, which is like the calories, versus having to think about, okay, now I'm adjusting my steps down plus the calories. It's just an extra variable to kind of manage. In the grand scheme of things, it's not going to make too much of a difference with your fat loss if you have one day that's either 8,000 steps versus 10,000. I think keeping that variable the same, so you keep in that same routine of hitting 10,000 steps, is probably what I would lean towards. But if you do get a few extra or a couple extra thousand less steps on one day, on that maintenance day, it's probably not going to make or break anything either. Because in reality, you're probably not burning a ton of extra calories for 2,000 steps, maybe like 1 to 200 extra calories, maybe. I think it's probably closer to like 100, but maybe 200. So you could really go either one. Like this, stressing over this is kind of being nitpicky, but I would just probably keep your routine the same just for simplicity's sake there. Katie asked, how many steps do you need to do daily to maintain weight and how many to potentially lose weight? So this will dictate, or this will be dictated by how many calories you burn in general, like based on your body size, like that's a big one. And then also how many calories you're eating. So like there isn't a magic amount of steps that you need to do to lose weight and a magic amount you need to do to maintain weight. Like I have some clients who their step goal is 4,000. And because maybe they're starting at a higher body weight, maybe 300-400 pounds, so their body in general just burns, a decent amount of calories, we're able to not have to drop calories too low without that much activity to still lose weight, because their body in general is just bigger and burns more calories. But there are some people, let me throw out some tangible numbers too, for example. So let's say somebody who is 350 pounds, they might burn like 2,700 calories, like by only getting 4,000 steps per day, because their body size is just that much bigger. So for that person to lose body fat consistently each week, let's say a pound on average, they could bring their calories down to maybe like 2,100, maybe 2,000, maybe 2,200, and lose 1 pound of fat consistently per week, only getting 4,000 steps, because their body size is so much bigger and they're just burning more calories at rest because of that. Somebody else who is maybe 5 foot and they weigh 120 pounds and they want to lose maybe 10 pounds, they might only, like if they only got 4,000 steps, they might only burn 1,500 calories per day, especially if they are older, if they're maybe like, let's say 60 years old. That person, to lose weight consistently, only getting 4,000 steps is going to be really tough, because if they only burn 1,400 calories getting 4,000 steps, then to lose 1 pound on average per week of body fat, like they're probably going to have to eat like 1,900 calories per day, which is really unsustainable in today's world. And when your calories start to get that low, you start to run the risk of maybe more vitamin and mineral deficiencies as well. So that person, their step requirement to consistently lose body fat, it's not that it's required for them to hit 10,000 step, let's say. Like they could lose body fat eating 800, 700, 600 calories per day. But in order to lose fat sustainably and healthily, I don't think that's a word, but in a healthy way, they would have to increase their activity by walking more in order to now, after getting 10,000 steps instead of 4,000, maybe they burn 1,800 calories per day. So now they can eat 1,400 and lose body fat consistently versus eating 800. So there's not a magic number of you have to eat or you have to do this many steps to lose weight and this many to maintain. It's all dependent on your current body size, your height, how many calories you burn while being sedentary based on those variables. But in general, the bigger you are, the less steps you can get away with and still lose fat consistently because your calorie budget is just so much bigger because you're just a bigger person and burn more versus a smaller individual. They're probably going to have to walk more and get more steps and if they want to lose more body weight. Like there are some clients that I've had who are smaller, 5 foot, and are roughly 130 pounds, let's say, and they want to still like lose 10 more pounds, and like, hey, we probably got to build steps up to 12,000, 13,000, sometimes even 14 to 15,000 on some days because they're just not burning a lot. And it's like you either burn more through getting more steps and more activity, or you have to get yourself to eat even less and get your calories, to that 1,100 mark, 1,000 mark maybe, depending on the person. And once you kind of start getting under 1,200 calories per day, I find a very hard time for me to like justify that, like prescribing that as a coach. Like under 1,200 calories, I'm like, okay, is this extra fat loss you really want? Is it really worth it at that point to be restricting your food intake that much to deal with the potential like vitamin and mineral deficiencies? And so hopefully that answered your question, Katie. But in general, what works for a lot of people and is 7,000 to 8,000 steps is a good benchmark to aim for just overall health. Not necessarily like weight loss or weight gain, but 7,000 to 8,000 steps typically maxes out the health benefits of walking in steps. It's what kind of the research shows. But for the purpose of weight loss, 8,000 is a good like kind of maintenance number for most people. If they're getting 8,000 steps, they're increasing their energy expenditure a decent amount to give themselves decent wiggle room with calories for either weight loss or maintenance. 10,000 plus is usually a good mark to aim for fat loss. I've found that when we boost steps up to that much, we get an extra couple hundred calorie burn per day, which helps with the fat loss equation, helps us to prevent us from having to decrease calories too much more to lose weight compared to if we weren't getting that many steps. But like I said, I've had some people on some extreme ends where like their starting point gives them the flexibility to, hey, 4,000 steps, like we're doing that and we're still seeing great fat loss. And then I had other people where based on their starting point where they're at, they have to go up to 13,000 steps maybe plus per day. So it's really individual. And that's why just like, working with a coach, and I know obviously, you're working with Katie and myself, like we're going to monitor these things week to week to see how your body specifically is responding. And we'll be able to find out what the right step count for you actually is for whatever goal you have at the time, whether it's fat loss or, maintenance at the time. So Karen asked, if eating at a restaurant and say you have chicken, green beans, and mashed potatoes, and you eat all the protein and veggies, but not all the potatoes, how do you track that? Because if you put half or 3/4, it's not going to count all the protein. So how does that work with tracking? So what you're kind of asking, just to reiterate, like for everyone else listening, is like, let's say you go to, I don't know, Texas Roadhouse or something, and they have a meal that's like 6 ounces of steak, mashed potatoes and green beans, right? And you look at their nutrition info online, and let's say the order like includes all of those. So it says the whole entire plate is 1,000 calories, and you are just eating the protein and the vegetables. How do you account for that? So you could kind of do a couple of things. One is you could just keep it simple. And, if you ate 3/4 of that plate, log 3/4 of it. Even if you didn't eat the mashed potatoes, but you mostly ate the protein and veggies, you could just keep it simple. It's not going to be perfect. It's probably going to be close enough, especially because you are eating out already, that whatever you log when you eat out, there's going to be variation and it's not going to be perfect. Like restaurant meals, even according to their website, like their nutrition info can be off by like 300, 400, 500 calories sometimes. Like there could be a meal that it says it's 1,000 calories, but whoever was back there cooking that day, they might have used extra butter, extra oil, gave you an extra portion size, and that could actually be 1,500 calories on that plate. So there's always going to be a pretty good variation with eating out, which is why like logging your food and eating out, it can work. But when you're in a fat loss phase, the less you can do it, the better, because you're just going to actually be eating what you think you're eating, based on what you're logging. So realizing like there's probably going to be some kind of variance there as far as what you think you're eating versus what you're logging. So don't overly stress about it being necessarily perfect. All we're trying to do is just get close in the ballpark range of how many calories we're probably eating, and probably overestimating a little bit just to give us some wiggle room in case there are extra calories snuck in. So you could just add it as like 3/4 of that meal, even if you didn't eat the mashed potatoes and ate the protein and veggies, and that's gonna overestimate your calories a little bit, maybe, but that's a good thing to like overestimate how much you think you're eating. Another thing you could do is you could log the individual food items on the plate. So let's say this is a sirloin steak and it's 6 ounces. You could go into MyFitnessPal and log sirloin steak 6 ounces. And then let's say you have asparagus on the side. You could log asparagus on the side, and then just not log the mashed potatoes if you don't eat them. But if you do that, I highly recommend adding probably at least 200 to 300 calories of butter or oil to that MyFitnessPal log to account for what they're cooking it in. Like people back at restaurants, they're not cooking just plain sirloin steak and plain asparagus. They're adding a ton of oil to those things, or butter. So you want to account for that, because that could easily be an extra 200 to 400 calories there. So that's kind of the second way you could go about logging it. If you're really concerned with like the protein necessarily not matching up, if you were to just take 3/4, you could just log those individual things. But I highly recommend probably adding 300 calories worth of oil or butter to that, just to account for that. So those are kind of the two different ways you can go about it. So hopefully that made sense, Karen. So you guys asked some really great questions this week. I loved it. So I will do these, continue to do these maybe every other week, maybe even every week if you guys are really liking them. Let me know in the comments if you do, and maybe we'll think about doing them more often. So yeah, thanks for submitting your questions. Appreciate it. Gives me some really great stuff to kind of go over and talk about, and hopefully they're super helpful and informative. And I will see you guys in the next one.